The cowboy rode through the desolate plains, the wind tugging relentlessly at his coat. Dust swirled around the hooves of his horse as he guided it carefully over the uneven terrain. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sun a harsh glare on the dry, cracked earth, and the silence of the open land weighed on him. He'd been tracking a herd for hours when something caught his eye, a faint, staggering movement near a worn wooden fence. Slowing his horse, he squinted through the haze, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. As he approached, the outline of a woman became clear. She was slumped against the fence, her clothing torn and dirt-streaked, her pale face streaked with sweat and grime. Her body trembled from exhaustion, and her hair hung in tangled strands around her gaunt face. Every instinct screamed caution, warning him that she might be a trap, a spy or worse. But another part of him, an unfamiliar, softer part, recognized the unmistakable signs of suffering. The woman's chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, and her eyes fluttered open as if sensing his approach. Fear and desperation clouded her gaze. Her lips parted, and a whisper barely audible carried across the dry wind. "Please, don't hurt me again." The words struck him sharply, carrying a pain that he hadn't expected to feel. It wasn't just fear in her voice. It was betrayal, exhaustion, and the weight of abuse. He froze for a moment, new certainty clawing at him. This was the wife of a man he had long considered an enemy, a man whose actions
As the morning
had caused bloodshed and
their
suffering
bond
across the
strengthened
territory.
further.
He shared
as he
small
looked at her,
pieces of his
he
own
felt an
life,
unexpected
tales of
pang
travels,
of empathy.
work,
The
and moments
cowboy
of humor,
dismounted
softening
carefully,
the edge of
placing
fear
a
that
steady
still
hand
lingered
on the
in her
reins
eyes.
of his horse.
He studied her, noting the offerings along her arms, the faint cuts on her legs, and the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of days without food or proper care. Her trembling intensified as he moved closer, and he instinctively slowed his pace, lowering his hands to show he carried no weapon. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him clearly. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of dried grass and the distant call of a hawk. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to focus on him, and when her gaze met his, he could see the flicker of hope battling with the terror in her eyes. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself, and yet the echo of past harm made her wary of any gesture of kindness. He knelt slightly to lower himself to her level, careful not to appear threatening. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he extended his hand, a silent offer of safety and refuge. The air between them was thick with tension, the kind that came when lives hang by a fragile thread. After a long, trembling moment, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his calloused hand, hesitant and unsure. He felt the frailty of her grip, and it struck him how delicate she truly was. The cowboy lifted her gently, supporting her weight, and her body sagged against his with an almost desperate relief. Every motion he made was cautious, every step deliberate, as if one wrong move might shatter the fragile trust she was beginning to place in him. Her head rested briefly against his shoulder, and he could feel
They
the
moved
rapid,
toward his
uneven
cabin,
beat of her
a
small
heart.
cluster of wooden structures and a modest fire pit that offered warmth and a sense of security. He avoided glancing at the distant hills where danger might be lurking. Now, all that mattered was her. Along the way, fragments of her story began to surface in hushed, broken sentences. She spoke of nights spent in fear of her husband's temper, off days without proper food or water, of being left behind while he sought fortune and pride over her survival. Her voice trembled with shame, but also with a quiet strength that she had clung to despite everything. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the plains, the cowboy guided her carefully to the shelter of the fire. Sparks flew as he added a small branch to the flames, and the warm glow illuminated her exhausted features. Her lips parted, and she whispered again, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would stop." He nodded slightly, understanding that gratitude and trust were luxuries she had rarely experienced. He sat beside her, keeping a protective distance, watching her recover. The smell of smoke mingled with the faint scent of dust and sweat, grounding them in the harsh reality of the wild. The night crept in slowly, bringing a cold that bit at exposed skin. He offered her a blanket, draping it gently over her shoulders. She shivered, curling slightly, but the warmth of the fire and his presence seemed to ease her trembling. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax, to breathe without immediate fear. He observed her quietly, mindful not to press too soon, but internally he wrestled with conflicting emotions, suspicion born of his knowledge of her husband, and compassion that he could no longer deny. Her eyes wandered to the horizon beyond the firelight, reflecting the last streaks of amber and gold. "I thought I'd be alone forever," she murmured. The cowboy said nothing, only listened, realizing that words were often unnecessary when presence alone could offer reassurance. Each sound, the crackle of the fire, the faint whistle of wind through the plains, the distant call of an owl, seemed to soothe her, reminding her that life, fragile and uncertain, could still offer moments of safety. He offered her water from his canteen and some dried meat, watching her devour it with a hunger born of days without proper sustenance. Her gratitude was quiet, expressed in small nods and whispered thanks. Yet the relief in her eyes spoke volumes. He could see the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders uncurled slightly, the softening tension in her hands. Even in the shadow of past trauma, the human spirit showed its resilience. As the moon rose high, casting silver light across the plains, he kept watch. Sleep was reluctant for both of them, for the world beyond the camp was not forgiving. Yet the simple act of sitting together, sharing warmth and silence, forged a bond that words could not describe. He vowed silently to protect her from further harm, knowing that danger lurked not only in the open land, but in the lingering reach of her husband's pride and wrath. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily upon him, but it was mingled with an unexpected tenderness. She was not just the wife of an enemy, she was a person, fragile yet enduring, who had suffered beyond measure. The cowboy's gaze softened as he watched her drift into an uneasy sleep, the blanket pulled tight around her. In the stillness of the night, he understood that his role had changed, from a solitary wanderer to a guardian of someone who had nowhere else to turn. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in muted oranges and purples, signaling the start of another day on the relentless plains. He rose quietly, adjusting his coat and tending to the horse, careful not to disturb her rest. In the new light, her face looked less haunted, though exhaustion still marked her features. He brought her a small basin of water to wash, and her eyes held a glimmer of life he hadn't seen before. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was hope nonetheless. By mid-morning, she was seated near the fire, eating carefully, and he kept a vigilant eye on the horizon. Conversation was minimal, yet the shared silence was comfortable. Each movement, each gesture carried meaning. Trust slowly being built, brick by brick. The cowboy realized that this encounter would change both their lives. For her, it was a chance to survive. For him, a test of compassion and courage that went beyond revenge or duty. Their paths had crossed in violence's shadow, yet something gentler, something enduring was beginning to take root. She stumbled toward him, her legs trembling under the weight of days, without proper food or water. Each step seemed like an enormous effort, and he instinctively reached out to steady her, guiding her carefully with his strong, steady hands. Her body shook violently against his, exhausted from weakness and fear. He felt the tiny, fragile pulse of life beneath her skin and realized how close she had been to collapse. The wind rustled the dry grasses around them, carrying dust that clung to her torn dress and disheveled hair, yet he paid it no mind, focused entirely on keeping her safe. As he held her, memories of her suffering unfolded in his mind, each detail painting a vivid, painful picture. She had spoken little on the way, but what she had said haunted him. The cruelty of her husband, his prideful abandonment, and her days of hunger and cold pressed against him like a physical weight. He understood now why she had been so wary, why the simple offer of help had almost brought tears to her eyes. Her trust had been broken before, and he intended to mend it, slowly, carefully. He guided her to his camp, fragile bridge over treacherous with a small wooden cabin and a fire pit, the flames flickering and dancing in the cool evening breeze. The fire cast a warm glow on her pale face, softening the stark outlines of exhaustion and suffering. She sank onto a rough wooden bench near the fire, curling in on herself as though the small circle of light could hold her safe from the world. He crouched near her, careful to maintain both proximity and respect, keeping his movements calm and deliberate to avoid alarming her. Her voice trembled when she spoke, fragments of her ordeal spilling out in halting whispers. I didn't think anyone would find me," she said, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. He left me, starving. I tried to walk, and then her words broke off into silence, leaving him to absorb the horror and suffering that words only partially conveyed. Each fragment of her story cut deeper than any blade, yet he did not flinch. His anger at her husband's cruelty mixed with compassion for her plight, forming a strange protective resolve. The cowboy handed her a small piece of dried bread and a canteen of water, insisting only gently, "Eat, drink, you need it." She accepted it with shaking hands, the desperation in her movements telling him how long it had been since she had felt even basic nourishment. He watched as she sipped the water and nibbled at the bread, noting the subtle changes in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped in exhaustion but her breathing began to steady, the way her eyelids lost some of their haunted glaze. Trust was growing, small and delicate, yet unmistakable. He did not speak much. Words were often unnecessary when presence alone could provide reassurance. Instead, he remained close, offering silent protection and support, adjusting the fire so the warmth reached her fully, and keeping his own body between her and the potential dangers of the outside world. Each shadow cast by the flames seemed less threatening with him near, and for the first time in many days she allowed herself to feel a measure of safety. Even a momentary sense of security was a rare luxury for her, one that she clung to tightly. The wind carried distant sounds across the plains, rustling grass, the faint call of a hawk, the whisper of trees, and he noticed how she flinched at each sound. Her hands clutched the blanket he had draped around her shoulders, and he resisted the urge to grab her too tightly, knowing the fragility of her emotional state. Slowly, she began to relax, leaning into the warmth of the fire and the steadiness of his presence. The firelight reflected in her eyes, catching hints of vulnerability and tentative trust, a contrast to the fear that had dominated her gaze only moments before. Night fell fully, bringing a biting chill that made the fire essential to their comfort. He offered her more bread and a portion of smoked meat, which she ate carefully, savoring each bite as if it were a treasure. Her movements became less erratic, more deliberate, and he could feel the tension in her body slowly easing. They sat in silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them, and in that quiet, fragile moment, a bond began to form. It was unspoken, yet powerful, an understanding that he would protect her, and that for now she could let herself depend on him. She finally looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. You didn't have to help me," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of emotion. He shook his head, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I couldn't let you suffer, not like this, not alone." There was no judgment in his tone, no expectation, only sincerity. It was enough to make her take a shaky breath, to lean back against the warmth of the fire, and to allow herself to imagine a future where she might survive, even thrive. Despite the hardships she had endured, hours passed, and sleep became inevitable, though tentative. He kept a watchful eye on her as she curled beneath the blanket, her breathing evening out into slow, steady rhythms. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it was mingled with an unexpected tenderness. She was not just the wife of an enemy. She was a person who had been pushed to the edge of despair, yet her spirit had not been entirely extinguished. His resolve hardened quietly. He would guard her, shield her from further harm, and allow her the space to regain her strength. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in muted pinks and purples, light spilling across the plains and casting long shadows that stretched toward the cabin. She stirred slightly, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. The quiet intensity in her look revealed a flicker of trust. He first fragile ember in the long night of suffering she had endured. He offered her water and more food, which she accepted with small, grateful nods. Each careful action reinforced their growing connection, each gesture a silent affirmation of safety and care. The world beyond the camp remained dangerous, unforgiving, yet within the small circle of firelight and shelter, she began to feel the first stirrings of hope. Her trembling lessened, and her gaze grew steadier. The cowboy remained vigilant, aware that danger could strike at any moment, yet committed to providing her this fragile sense of safety. Together, in the quiet of the morning, they shared a small reprieve from the hardships of the wild plains. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of dry grass and smoke, and a sense of calm began to settle over the camp. By mid-mornings, she was seated near the fire, slowly eating and sipping water, her hands no longer shaking violently. Conversation was minimal, yet the silence was comfortable. Their connection needed no words. It was built through shared moments of protection, trust, and understanding. He adjusted the fire, tended to the horse, and kept a watchful eye on the horizon, yet he returned frequently to her side, ensuring she was safe. In those simple, quiet actions, a profound bond began to solidify, one that neither past suffering nor the harshness of the plains could easily undo. The cowboy's presence became a constant reassurance. She began to shift, lifting her head and shoulders, stretching limbs stiff from days of deprivation. He offered assistance when needed, yet allowed her autonomy, recognizing the delicate balance between protection and empowerment. Step by step, bite by bite, the fragile trust between them grew stronger, a testament to human resilience and the capacity for care even in the bleakest circumstances. For her, each moment of safety felt miraculous. For him, each act of protection affirmed a deeper part of himself he had rarely acknowledged. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the camp seemed transformed. She had regained some color in her cheeks, her movements had become smoother, and the haunted look in her eyes had softened. The cowboy remained beside her, offering words only when necessary, wallowing presence to speak louder than speech. In the vast, empty plains, their bond was a small island of warmth and humanity. The fire continued to crackle, the horse grazed quietly nearby, and the world outside the circle of light could wait. For now, it was enough that they were together, surviving, and cautiously beginning to heal. He brought her water and bread, holding the small cup carefully so that she could sip without spilling. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought the bread to her lips, and he watched in silence as she devoured it ravenously, the hunger of days without sustenance evident in every bite. The soft firelight reflected off her dark, tired eyes, which had once been wide with fear. Now, as she paused to catch her breath, the sharp edge of panic softened into a glimmer of trust. She looked at him tentatively, as if testing the limits of the safety he offered. You won't hurt me?" she asked, her voice quivering. The question lingered in the air, a fragile thread of fear stretching between them. He shook his head slowly, speaking through his eyes and actions rather than words, letting her feel the certainty and strength behind his reassurance. She nodded slightly, though her lips still quivered, as if the concept of protection was almost foreign to her. In that moment, he realized how deep her wounds ran. Not only physical, but emotional, etched from years of cruelty and neglect. Night fell over the plains, shrouding the land in a blanket of darkness. Outside, the wind, presence of another human being in need, sparked a protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. He vowed silently that he would shield her from harm, from her past, and from the unforgiving world outside the cabin. In that quiet pledge, he felt a weight lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. By the early hours of morning, she stirred slightly, half awake, but she did not panic. The safety he provided allowed her to remain in the liminal space between wakefulness and rest, without fear. He watched over her, adjusting the blanket and stoking the fire when necessary, ensuring that no sudden chill or threat could break the fragile peace. She finally spoke in a whisper, asking simple questions about the land, the weather, and the fire, and he answered softly, grounding her with calm, steady words. The questions were innocent, yet they reflected a small reclaiming of autonomy she had not felt in days. Daylight eventually broke across the plains, casting soft golden light through the small window of the cabin. She rose slowly, muscles stiff, and he guided her to a chair by the fire. She ate breakfast, and then he watched quietly, noting the subtle signs of her recovery, color returning to her cheeks, the tension in her hands easing, the flicker of light in her eyes. The world outside remained harsh, yet within this small circle of warmth, she began to believe she could survive, perhaps even thrive. He stayed close, offering aid when necessary, yet allowing her independence whenever possible.